Most people walk away from humiliation. They lower their heads, swallow the pain, and disappear into the crowd. But every once in a while, someone doesn't walk away, and what they do instead, nobody in that room ever forgot it. This is the story of a man who was publicly humiliated in front of everyone he knew, mocked, dismissed, reduced to nothing, in front of 40 people, by a woman who thought she had the right to do it. And the moment that followed, nobody saw coming. Not her, not the crowd, and certainly not him. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll be asking yourself one question. Was this revenge or something far more powerful? Before we get to that moment, and we will get there, you need to understand a few things. Because this story isn't just about one dinner, one woman, one insult. This story is about something every man in America understands in his bones. There were 40 people in that room. Every single one of them witnessed what she did. Every single one of them thought they knew how this story would end. They were wrong. Let me take you back to where this really started. His name was Robert Callahan, and if you passed him on the street, you wouldn't look twice. That was never a problem for Robert. He wasn't the kind of man who needed you to look twice. Robert was 58 years old, a contractor, remodeling, renovation, the kind of work that turns a broken-down house into someone's home. He grew up in a family where you worked with your hands and you kept your word. His father was the same way, the kind of man who shook your hand and meant it. His father used to tell him, "Dignity isn't something you wear, it's not a watch, it's not a car, it's not a title on a business card. Dignity is something you carry, right here, and nobody can take it from you unless you let them." Robert never forgot that. The people who knew Robert, really knew him, said he was the kind of man you wanted in your corner when things got hard. Not because he had money, not because he had connections, but because when he said he'd show up, he showed up every time. No excuses, no complaints. But life had not been easy on Robert Callahan. 3 years before that dinner, he went through a divorce that cost him nearly everything. The house, the savings, a future he thought he had planned. He didn't talk about it much. Men like Robert don't. He just put his head down and started rebuilding. The same way he rebuilt everything else, slowly, quietly, one piece at a time. By the time of this story, Robert was back on his feet. Not rich, not flashy, but steady. And in the world Robert came from, steady meant everything. Now let me tell you about the other side of this story. Her name was Diana Marsh, 44 years old, daughter of a successful real estate developer who had done very, very well for himself. Diana had grown up with the best of everything. The schools, the trips, the social circles, the sense that the world was arranged for her convenience. People who knew Diana described her as charming, and she was, when it suited her. She could light up a room. She was smart, well-connected, and she knew exactly how to work a social situation. But there was another side, one that came out in quieter moments, or louder ones. When Diana felt she was in the presence of someone she considered, beneath her she had a way of making people feel small, not always loudly. Sometimes it was a look, a dismissive laugh, a comment dressed up as a joke. The kind of thing that leaves a mark but gives her room to say, "Oh, I was only kidding. Can't you take a joke?" Most people let it go. That's what you do with someone like Diana. You let it go because making a scene costs more than it's worth. Robert Callahan was about to change that calculation. Robert and Diana crossed paths at a mutual friend's dinner party, a birthday celebration for a man named James, a well-liked local businessman who had known both of them for years, though from very different corners of his life. James was the kind of man who brought different worlds together, never thinking twice about it. It was the kind of evening where everyone was on their best behavior. Good food, good wine, conversation that stayed light and easy. Robert had almost not come. He wasn't much for these kinds of events, but James was a good friend. So he came. He put on a clean jacket. He showed up, like he always did. He was seated near Diana, not next to her, near her, close enough that when the conversation found its way to him, she could hear every word. And that's where it began. It started with small talk. Someone asked Robert about his work. Friendly enough, the kind of question you ask at a dinner table when you don't know someone well. Robert answered honestly, contractor, remodeling, renovation work. He even smiled a little talking about it. He was proud of his work, he always had been, and that's when Diana laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a misunderstanding, a laugh that made it clear this was intentional. She looked at him the way some people look at something they've decided doesn't belong in the room. She said, and these words were confirmed later by multiple people at that table. She said, "Oh, so you fix things for a living? That's cute." Then she reached into her purse, and she pulled out a handful of bills, and she leaned forward, and she tossed them across the table, toward him, like she was tipping a valet. "Here," she said. "Maybe this will help." 40 people. Not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. Every single eye in that room moved from Diana Marsh to Robert Callahan, and Robert didn't move. He sat there, looking at the money, and something was happening behind his eyes that nobody in that room could quite read. Was it anger? Was it humiliation? Was it the kind of pain that lives in a man's chest and never really leaves? Nobody knew, because Robert's face gave away nothing. And then he did something nobody expected. Robert reached out, slowly, and he began picking up the bills, one by one. No rush, no anger on his face. Just quiet, deliberate movement. The whole table watched. Diana watched. The birthday boy, James, watched from across the room. When he had picked up every single one, he stood up. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his glass and took one slow sip of water. Then he walked, not quickly, not storming out. He walked calmly around the table to where James was sitting. He placed the money in James's hand, and he said, loud enough for the table to hear, "Put this toward the bill for everyone, a gift from her." Then Robert turned. He looked directly at Diana Marsh, and the room held its breath. He said 7 words. "My father taught me what real wealth is." And then he walked out. Within 48 hours, 3 people who had been at that dinner had told the story to someone else. Within a week, it had traveled through every social circle in that town. People talked about it at offices, at church, over backyard fences, because something about it landed differently than a regular story. It stuck to people. Some people said Robert handled it with more class than anyone they had ever seen. Others said he should have said more, done more, that walking away was letting her off easy. But here's what almost nobody at that table knew. The part of this story that changes everything. While Robert had been rebuilding his life after the divorce, quietly, without telling many people, he had taken every dollar he had saved and invested it into a small commercial property on the edge of town. He had done the renovation himself, every wall, every floor, every detail. The same hands Diana had laughed at built that building back from nothing. And 6 months before that dinner party, Robert had signed a lease agreement with a new tenant, a restaurant group, young owners, big vision, just starting out. Robert had believed in them when most people hadn't. He gave them fair terms. He shook their hands and meant it. Within 18 months, that restaurant became one of the most talked about dining spots in the region. Lines out the door, national food publications picking up the story. And Robert Callahan, the man Diana Marsh had thrown money at, was collecting rental income every single month from one of the most successful businesses in the area. He never told anyone at that dinner. He never brought it up afterward. He never used it as a comeback or posted about it online. That was never the point. That had never been the point. Someone tracked Robert down sometime later, asked him about that night, about Diana, about the money, about all of it. He paused for a long time before he answered. Long enough that the person asking thought maybe he wouldn't. Then Robert said, "She didn't embarrass me. She embarrassed herself. And I'll tell you the truth, I felt sorry for her, because she is going to spend her whole life measuring people by the wrong ruler, and that's a sad way to live." Here's what I keep coming back to. We live in a world that constantly tells men, especially men who've been knocked down, men who've had to start over, that your value is what you drive, what your title says, how expensive your shoes are, how quickly people snap to attention when you walk into a room. Robert Callahan walked out of that restaurant with nothing to prove, no title, no announcement, no moment of visible victory, just 7 words and an open door. And yet every single person in that room was still thinking about him days later, still talking about him weeks later, because he did the hardest thing a man can do when someone tries to take his dignity. He showed them they couldn't have it. His father was right. Dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you carry. And nobody, not money, not mockery, not a room full of witnesses, nobody can take it from you unless you hand it over. Robert Callahan never handed it over. The real question isn't what he did that night. The real question is, how many of us would have had the strength to do the same? Think about that, and drop your answer in the comments below. Because I want to know, what would you have done? If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes the right story finds you at exactly the right moment. And if you want more stories like this one, real stories about character, dignity, and the kind of strength that doesn't make noise, subscribe, hit that bell. Because next week, I'm bringing you a story about a man who was fired in front of his entire team, publicly, deliberately, and what he built in the 5 years after that will genuinely stop you in your tracks. You don't want to miss it.